Imagine a habit so deadly that doctors now call it the new smoking. Yet millions of older adults do it for 10 hours every day without realizing they're slowly destroying their bodies from the inside out. But the world of modern health threats holds far more than the obvious dangers we all know about. While we've spent decades warning people about cigarettes, sugar, and stress, something far more insidious has crept into our daily lives. Something that feels completely harmless. Here's what most people don't know. Sitting for just 6 hours a day increases your risk of early death by 40%, even if you exercise regularly. Scientists have discovered that prolonged sitting triggers a cascade of biological changes so profound that they found enzyme activity in your legs drops by 90% within minutes of sitting down. And perhaps most shocking of all, researchers examining the bodies of elderly individuals who sat excessively found that their muscles had literally begun to consume themselves at the cellular level. This isn't just about comfort or laziness. This is about a biological time bomb ticking inside the bodies of anyone over 60 who spends their days in chairs, on couches, or behind desks. The damage is silent, progressive, and steeped in mystery, because what's happening inside your body while you sit is far more catastrophic than anyone imagined just a decade ago. Today, we'll uncover 5 of the most devastating dangers of excessive sitting in old age, each one more alarming than the last. And the first one? It begins destroying your body within 24 hours of your last walk. Danger 1. Blood clots and the silent killer in your veins. Let's start with something that killed Margaret Chen's husband on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Margaret and Robert were both 67, retired teachers living in Portland. Robert spent his mornings reading the newspaper, his afternoons watching classic movies, and his evenings on the computer catching up with old friends. A typical day for millions of retirees. But what Robert didn't know, what his doctor never thought to mention, was that every hour he sat still, his blood was slowing down. Here's the terrifying part. When you sit motionless for extended periods, blood pools in your legs. But why does this matter? Because slower blood flow means higher risk of clotting. And those clots? They don't just stay put. Robert stood up to get dinner one evening, and a clot that had been forming in his calf for days suddenly broke free. Within seconds, it traveled through his bloodstream toward his lungs. By the time Margaret called 911, he was gasping for air. The clot had lodged in his pulmonary artery, a condition called pulmonary embolism. He died before the ambulance arrived. Now, you might be thinking, that's extreme. That won't happen to me. But here's what researchers at the University of Vermont discovered. Adults over 60 who sit for more than 10 hours daily have an 80% higher risk of developing venous thromboembolism, the medical term for dangerous blood clots. And it gets worse. The risk doesn't just apply to people who are completely sedentary. A landmark study published in the British Medical Journal followed 70,000 adults and found that even those who exercised regularly but sat for prolonged periods still faced dramatically elevated clot risk. Exercise helps, but it doesn't erase the damage of sitting. So what's actually happening inside your veins? When you're upright and moving, your calf muscles act like pumps, squeezing blood back up toward your heart against gravity. But when you sit, those muscle contractions stop. Blood begins to stagnate. And stagnant blood is sticky blood. Within 90 minutes of continuous sitting, blood flow in your legs can drop by 50%. That's when platelets, the cells responsible for clotting, start clumping together. At first, these are tiny, harmless clusters. But hour after hour, day after day, they grow larger. And here's the kicker. You feel absolutely nothing. Dr. David Katz, former director of Yale University's Prevention Research Center, describes it as a biological accident waiting to happen. Because once that clot reaches a certain size, any sudden movement, standing up, bending over, even coughing, can dislodge it. But where does it go? If it travels to your lungs, you get a pulmonary embolism like Robert. If it reaches your brain, you're looking at a stroke. If it blocks an artery in your heart, it's a heart attack. All 3 are leading killers of people over 65, and all 3 are directly linked to prolonged sitting. One woman in Ohio, a 63-year-old named Linda, spent an entire weekend binge-watching a new series. 14 hours on Saturday, 12 on Sunday. By Monday morning, her left leg was swollen and painful. She thought she'd pulled a muscle. 3 days later, she collapsed at the grocery store. The clot had traveled from her leg to her lung. She survived, but barely. And her doctor told her something chilling. If you'd waited one more day, you wouldn't have made it. Now here's what makes this even more dangerous for older adults specifically. As we age, our blood naturally becomes more prone to clotting. Combine that with medications many seniors take, like hormone replacements or certain cancer treatments, and the risk multiplies exponentially. So what's the solution? The answer isn't just move more, it's about breaking up sitting time. Researchers found that standing or walking for just 5 minutes every hour reduces clot formation by up to 60%. Not a marathon. Not even a workout. Just movement. But if blood clots are forming in your legs right now, there's another danger already at work. One that's attacking your heart at this very moment. Danger 2. Heart disease and the cardiac catastrophe. Let me tell you about James Patterson, not the author, but a 71-year-old former construction worker from Ohio who thought he'd earned his retirement on the couch. James had been active his whole life. Strong. Healthy. No family history of heart problems. But after retiring at 65, his routine changed dramatically. He'd wake up, eat breakfast at the kitchen table, move to his recliner for the morning news, stay there for lunch, and spend afternoons watching sports. By his own estimate, he sat 12 to 14 hours daily. I figured I'd earned it, he told his cardiologist later. 50 years of hard labor. Time to rest. At 70, James had his first heart attack. It came out of nowhere, or so he thought. But here's what was really happening inside his body. Every hour James spent sitting, his heart was slowly suffocating. When you sit for prolonged periods, your body enters what scientists call a metabolic shutdown. HDL cholesterol, the good kind that clears your arteries, drops by up to 20%. Meanwhile, triglycerides, the bad fats, spike. Enzymes that break down fat in your bloodstream essentially turn off. And inflammation markers flood your system. Dr. David Dunstan, who led a groundbreaking study at the Baker Heart and Diabetes Institute in Australia, found something shocking. Sitting for just 1 hour triggers immediate changes in vascular function. Blood flow to your arteries becomes restricted. Your blood vessels stiffen. And your heart has to work significantly harder to pump blood through your body. Now multiply that by 10 or 12 hours a day, 365 days a year. A massive study of over 80,000 adults published in The Lancet found that people who sit for 8+ hours daily have a 147% higher risk of cardiovascular events, heart attacks, strokes, heart failure, compared to those who sit less than 4 hours. 147%. That's nearly 2.5 times the risk. But why is sitting specifically so deadly for your heart? Think of your cardiovascular system like a river. When water flows steadily, it stays clean and clear. But when it slows to a trickle, it stagnates. Sediment builds up. Algae forms. The whole ecosystem suffers. Your blood is the same way. When you move, blood flows vigorously through your arteries, keeping them flexible and clean. But when you sit motionless, blood slows, cholesterol deposits stick to artery walls, and those deposits harden into plaque. This is atherosclerosis, the silent process that killed James Patterson's father and nearly killed James himself. Here's the part that haunts cardiologists. The damage is cumulative. Every day you sit excessively adds another microscopic layer of plaque to your arteries. And unlike some health conditions that stabilize or reverse, atherosclerosis is progressive. Once it starts, it only gets worse unless you intervene. Dr. Joan Manson, Chief of Preventive Medicine at Brigham and Women's Hospital, explains, we're seeing 60-year-olds with the arteries of 80-year-olds. And when we ask about their lifestyle, the common thread is always the same, prolonged sitting. There's a woman named Patricia in Florida who experienced this firsthand. At 68, she went in for a routine checkup. Her doctor ordered a calcium scan, a test that measures plaque buildup in coronary arteries. Patricia's score was 847. Anything above 400 is considered severe disease. She was shocked. She didn't smoke. She ate relatively well. She had no symptoms. But when her doctor asked about her daily routine, the picture became clear. Patricia spent 9 hours a day sitting, at breakfast, watching TV, doing puzzles, reading. She thought sitting was restful, harmless. She was wrong. Within 6 months, Patricia needed a triple bypass. 3 of her major arteries were more than 70% blocked. Now here's where this gets truly frightening for older adults. Your body's ability to repair arterial damage declines with age. When you're young, your endothelial cells, the inner lining of your blood vessels, can regenerate and heal minor damage. But after 60, that regenerative capacity plummets. So every hour of sitting does more permanent damage than it would have done 20 years earlier. Researchers at the Mayo Clinic found that adults over 65 who sit excessively show arterial stiffness equivalent to adding 8 additional years to their cardiovascular age. A 70-year-old who sits 10 hours daily has the arteries of a 78-year-old. But here's a glimmer of hope. When James Patterson's cardiologist put him on a strict movement protocol, standing every 30 minutes, walking after meals, using a standing desk for hobbies, his follow-up tests 6 months later showed measurable improvement. His HDL cholesterol rose. His inflammation markers dropped. His arterial stiffness decreased. The damage wasn't fully reversed, but it was arrested. And that, his doctor said, likely saved his life. Yet while James was fighting to save his heart, another danger was silently weakening his bones. A danger that would put him at risk for something even more immediately catastrophic. Danger 3. Muscle atrophy and bone loss. The collapse from within. Dorothy Evans was 74 when she fell in her kitchen. It wasn't a dramatic fall, no icy sidewalk, no missed step on the stairs. She simply stood up from her chair to get a glass of water, felt her legs wobble, and crumpled to the floor. The impact shattered her hip in 3 places. What Dorothy didn't know was that her skeleton had been crumbling for years. When paramedics arrived, they carefully lifted her onto a stretcher. But during transport, Dorothy screamed in pain. The EMTs hadn't done anything wrong. Her ribs had fractured just from being moved. At the hospital, X-rays revealed the horrifying truth. Dorothy's bones had become so porous, so fragile, that they were fracturing under the slightest pressure. She had severe osteoporosis. And doctors traced it directly back to one thing. She'd spent the last decade sitting for 14 hours a day. Here's what most people don't understand about bones. They're living tissue, constantly rebuilding themselves. But that rebuilding process requires one critical thing: mechanical stress. When you stand, walk, or move, gravity and muscle contractions create tiny microfractures in your bones. Your body responds by laying down new, stronger bone tissue. It's a beautiful system, but it only works if you use it. When you sit for prolonged periods, that mechanical stress vanishes. Your bones interpret the lack of pressure as a signal: we don't need to be strong anymore. And they begin to dissolve themselves. A study from the University of California followed 1,400 women over age 60 and found that each additional hour of daily sitting was associated with a 1% decrease in bone density. 1% might not sound like much, but over a decade of sitting 10 hours a day, that's a catastrophic loss. Dr. Susan OTT, a bone specialist at the University of Washington, describes it this way: sitting is essentially putting your skeleton in retirement. And retired bones become brittle bones. But bones aren't the only thing deteriorating. Your muscles are vanishing too. Remember how I mentioned earlier that enzyme activity in your legs drops by 90% within minutes of sitting? Those enzymes are critical for muscle maintenance. Without them, your muscles don't just weaken. They actually begin to atrophy, shrinking in size and losing their ability to function. Researchers using MRI scans compared the legs of active 70-year-olds with sedentary 70-year-olds. The difference was staggering. The sedentary group had 30% less muscle mass in their quadriceps and calves. In some cases, muscle tissue had been replaced entirely by fat. Now here's why this is so dangerous. Muscles and bones work together. Strong muscles protect bones during falls. They stabilize joints. They help you catch yourself when you stumble. But when both systems fail simultaneously, which is exactly what happens with prolonged sitting, you become frighteningly fragile. A man named George in Pennsylvania experienced this firsthand. At 69, he tripped over his dog's leash. something that would have been a minor stumble in his younger years. But George's weakened leg muscles couldn't catch him, and his brittle bones couldn't withstand the impact. He broke his femur, his wrist, and 3 vertebrae in a single fall. The recovery took 14 months. George never regained full mobility. But here's what makes this danger especially cruel. Muscle and bone loss create a vicious cycle. When you lose muscle strength, standing and walking become harder. So you sit more. And the more you sit, the more muscle you lose, which makes moving even harder. Before long, you're trapped in your chair, not by choice, but by physical incapacity. Dr. Nathan Lebrasseur, who studies aging at the Mayo Clinic, calls this the sitting death spiral. His documented cases of people in their late 60s and early 70s who went from fully independent to requiring walkers or wheelchairs in less than 2 years. All because they sat excessively and their bodies literally withered away. And there's a particularly insidious aspect of this for older adults. The damage accelerates with age. A young person who sits all day will lose some muscle mass. Yes. But their body can rebuild it relatively quickly with exercise. An older person? Their muscle protein synthesis, the process of building new muscle, operates at about 50% efficiency compared to their younger years. This means that every day of sitting does more irreversible damage than it would have decades ago. And regaining that lost muscle is exponentially harder. But before moving on, I would like to ask you for something. If you like these documentaries and want to support me, please consider subscribing. It's free. Now, there's a study from Japan that offers a sobering wake-up call. Researchers followed 2,000 adults over age 65 for 8 years. Those who sat more than 9 hours daily were 3 times more likely to become physically disabled, unable to dress themselves, bathe independently, or walk without assistance, compared to those who sat less than 5 hours. 3 times more likely to lose their independence, to need full-time care, to become confined to a bed or chair permanently. Dorothy Evans understood this after her fall. During her painful recovery, she made a vow, never again. She bought a timer that buzzed every 30 minutes, reminding her to stand and move. She started doing simple strength exercises with resistance bands. She walked laps around her apartment. 2 years later, a bone density scan showed measurable improvement. Her muscles, while not fully restored, had regained significant strength. She could stand from a chair without using her arms. She could walk without fear. Her doctor called it remarkable. Dorothy called it survival. But even as Dorothy was rebuilding her strength, another danger was attacking her from the inside. One that was silently destroying her metabolic system and putting her on a path toward a disease that would change everything. Danger 4. Diabetes and metabolic collapse. Michael Jong was 66 years old when his vision started blurring. He chalked it up to needing new glasses. But then came the constant thirst, the frequent urination, the exhaustion that made him want to sit down after the smallest tasks. When he finally saw his doctor, the diagnosis hit him like a freight train: type 2 diabetes. His blood sugar was dangerously high, 347 milligrams per deciliter, more than triple the normal level. "But I don't eat that much sugar," Michael protested. "I'm not overweight. How is this possible?" His doctor asked one simple question: how many hours a day do you sit? Michael thought about it. Morning coffee at the table, 1 hour. Computer work for a hobby blog, 3 hours. Lunch, 1 hour. Afternoon TV, 4 hours. Dinner and evening reading, 3 hours. 12 hours total. That, his doctor said, is how. Here's what's happening inside your body when you sit for extended periods, and it's more sinister than most people realize. When you eat, your body releases insulin to help shuttle glucose, sugar, from your bloodstream into your cells for energy. But when you sit motionless, your muscles, which normally act like sponges, soaking up glucose, essentially go offline. They stop responding to insulin efficiently. This is called insulin resistance, and it's the gateway to type 2 diabetes. A groundbreaking study from the University of Leicester analyzed data from nearly 800,000 people and found that sitting for prolonged periods increases diabetes risk by 112%, more than doubling your chances of developing the disease. And the effect was independent of body weight, diet, or exercise habits. You could be thin, eat healthy, and exercise regularly, and still develop diabetes if you sit too much. But why is sitting specifically so destructive to your metabolism? Dr. Mark Hamilton, a professor of health and human performance, discovered something remarkable. When you stand or move, your leg muscles produce an enzyme called lipoprotein lipase, LPL, which breaks down fat and sugar in your bloodstream. But when you sit, LPL production drops by 90% within minutes. 90%. Almost complete shutdown. Without LPL, fat and sugar remain in your blood instead of being processed and stored properly. Your pancreas compensates by pumping out more insulin. Over time, your cells become numb to insulin signals, like someone shouting in your ear until you stop listening. Eventually, your pancreas can't keep up, your blood sugar stays chronically elevated, and you've crossed the threshold into diabetes. Now here's where this becomes a nightmare for older adults specifically. As we age, our baseline insulin sensitivity already declines. A 70-year-old's cells naturally respond about 30% less efficiently to insulin than a 30-year-old's. Add prolonged sitting on top of that aging effect, you're looking at a metabolic catastrophe waiting to happen. There's a woman named Ruth in Michigan who lived this nightmare. At 68, she was diagnosed with prediabetes, blood sugar levels that were elevated but not yet diabetic. Her doctor warned her, "Change your habits now, or this will progress." But Ruth didn't think sitting was a habit that needed changing. She thought diabetes was about diet. So she cut out sweets, reduced her portions, and continued sitting 10 hours a day watching her grandchildren via video calls, doing crossword puzzles, and reading. 18 months later, she was diabetic. Her fasting blood sugar had climbed from 118 to 164. She needed medication. And within 3 years, she was dealing with diabetic neuropathy, nerve damage in her feet that made walking painful and difficult. The irony? The sitting made walking harder, which made her sit more, which made her diabetes worse. But here's the most devastating part about diabetes in older adults. The complications are accelerated and more severe. Diabetes damages blood vessels throughout your body. In your eyes, it can cause blindness. In your kidneys, it leads to failure. In your feet, it can result in amputations. And in older adults, whose bodies already have reduced healing capacity, these complications progress faster and with more severe outcomes. A study published in Diabetes Care found that adults over 65 with diabetes face twice the risk of heart attack, 3 times the risk of kidney failure, and 4 times the risk of stroke compared to non-diabetic peers. Michael Jong learned this the hard way. 2 years after his diagnosis, despite medication, he developed diabetic retinopathy, damage to the blood vessels in his eyes. His vision continued to deteriorate. Driving at night became impossible. Reading became a struggle. His doctor finally got through to him. Every hour you sit is another hour your blood sugar stays elevated, damaging your blood vessels. You can take all the medication in the world, but if you don't move, you're fighting a losing battle. Michael started using a standing desk. He set alarms to walk for 5 minutes every hour. He did leg exercises while watching TV, simple marching in place, heel raises, knee lifts. Nothing strenuous, but consistent. Within 6 months, his hemoglobin A1C, a measure of long-term blood sugar control, dropped from 8.2% to 6.9%. His medication was reduced. His energy returned. And most importantly, his retinopathy stabilized. But here's the truly shocking research. A study from the University of Florida found that breaking up sitting time with just 2 to 3 minutes of light walking every half hour reduced blood sugar spikes by 32% after meals, more effective than some diabetes medications. 2 to 3 minutes. Not a workout. Not even a brisk walk. Just gentle movement. And it was enough to dramatically alter metabolic function. Yet millions of older adults are still sitting for 10, 12, even 14 hours a day, completely unaware that they're marching toward diabetes, vision loss, kidney failure, and amputations, all preventable with simple, frequent movement. But even as their blood sugar was spiraling out of control, another danger was mounting. One that would attack their minds, steal their memories, and leave them unable to recognize their own families. Danger 5. Cognitive decline and the vanishing mind. Helen Morrison used to do the New York Times crossword puzzle every morning in under 20 minutes. By age 72, after 5 years of increasing sedentary behavior following her husband's death, she couldn't remember what day of the week it was. She'd forget conversations she'd had an hour earlier. She'd get lost driving to the grocery store she'd shopped at for 30 years. Her daughter, Sarah, knew something was terribly wrong. The neurologist's diagnosis was devastating: early-stage vascular dementia, likely progressing toward Alzheimer's. Brain scans showed disturbing patterns: reduced blood flow to critical regions, shrinkage in the hippocampus, the memory center, and the beginning stages of neural degeneration. When Sarah asked what caused it, the neurologist asked about Helen's lifestyle. After her husband died, Helen had withdrawn. She stopped going to her book club, stopped taking daily walks, stopped volunteering at the library. Instead, she spent her days sitting, on the couch watching TV, at the kitchen table staring into space, in bed reading until she fell asleep. 14 to 16 hours of sitting daily. For 5 years. The human brain, the neurologist explained, requires movement to survive. Here's what researchers at UCLA discovered that should terrify anyone over 60. Sitting for prolonged periods physically shrinks your brain. Using MRI scans, they studied middle-aged and older adults, measuring both sitting time and brain structure. The results were shocking. People who sat for more than 7 hours daily showed significant thinning in the medial temporal lobe, the region critical for forming new memories. And this thinning was comparable to the brain changes seen in early Alzheimer's disease. But why? Why does sitting destroy your brain? Your brain is an incredibly hungry organ. Despite being only 2% of your body weight, it consumes 20% of your oxygen and glucose. To fuel that demand, it requires robust blood flow, about 750 milliliters of blood per minute under normal conditions. But when you sit for extended periods, blood flow throughout your entire body slows, including to your brain. A study using Doppler ultrasound found that cerebral blood flow decreases by up to 20% after just 1 hour of continuous sitting. 20% less oxygen, 20% less glucose, 20% less fuel for the most energy-demanding organ in your body. Now imagine that happening 10, 12, 14 hours a day, every single day, 4 years. Dr. David Rachlin, a biological anthropologist at the University of Southern California, explains, the brain interprets reduced blood flow as a signal that it's not needed at full capacity. So it begins to prune itself, eliminating neural connections, shrinking structures, reducing metabolic activity. In other words, your brain is designed to adapt to your lifestyle. If you sit all day, it adapts by downsizing. A horrifying study from the University of Western Australia followed 3,500 adults over age 60 for 12 years. Those who sat more than 10 hours daily showed 63% faster cognitive decline compared to those who sat less than 4 hours. Their processing speed, memory recall, and executive function all deteriorated at accelerated rates. 63% faster. That's the difference between maintaining mental sharpness into your 80s and developing dementia in your 70s. But there's another mechanism at work here, one that's even more insidious. When you sit motionless, a protein called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, plummets. BDNF is essentially fertilizer for your brain. It promotes the growth of new neurons, strengthens existing connections, and protects against neural degeneration. Exercise and movement stimulate BDNF production. Sitting suppresses it. A study published in Neurology found that sedentary older adults had BDNF levels 40% lower than active peers. And low BDNF is one of the strongest predictors of Alzheimer's disease. There's a man in Colorado named Frank who experienced this decline firsthand. At 68, he retired from a physically active job as a park ranger. Suddenly, instead of hiking trails and leading tours, he was sitting at home, watching nature documentaries instead of experiencing nature. Within 3 years, his wife noticed changes. He'd repeat stories he'd told 20 minutes earlier. He'd forget appointments. He'd struggle to find words mid-sentence. A neuropsychological evaluation confirmed mild cognitive impairment, the stage between normal aging and dementia. His doctor was blunt: if you don't change your lifestyle immediately, this will progress to full dementia within 5 years. Frank was terrified. But he also got angry. Not at his doctor, at himself. For letting his brain atrophy. For choosing the couch over the trails he'd loved his entire life. He bought a treadmill and placed it in front of the TV. While watching his nature documentaries, he walked, slowly at first, just 15 minutes at a time. He started doing jigsaw puzzles while standing at a counter. He joined a walking group at a local senior center. The results were remarkable. 18 months later, follow-up testing showed that Frank's cognitive decline had not only stopped but partially reversed. His memory scores improved. His verbal fluency returned. Brain scans showed increased hippocampal volume. His memory center had actually grown. His neurologist called it one of the most dramatic reversals she'd ever seen. Frank called it choosing to fight for my mind. But here's what makes this danger so uniquely cruel. Cognitive decline creates the same vicious cycle as muscle loss. When your brain starts failing, making decisions becomes harder. Motivation drops. You lose interest in activities. So you sit more. And the more you sit, the worse your brain gets, which makes you sit even more. Before long, you're trapped in a fog of confusion, unable to remember why you wanted to move in the first place. A haunting study from Johns Hopkins followed nursing home residents and found that those with advanced dementia sat, on average, 19 hours per day. Not because they were too physically frail to move, but because their damaged brains no longer sent the signals to stand up. They'd sat themselves into cognitive oblivion. Helen Morrison's story didn't have as happy an ending as Frank's. By the time her daughter intervened, the damage was too advanced. Helen continued to decline, eventually requiring full-time memory care. Sarah still wonders, what if we'd known 5 years earlier? What if Mom had kept moving? But here's the research that offers genuine hope. A massive meta-analysis of 38 studies found that physical activity reduces dementia risk by 35 to 40%. And the protective effect is strongest when movement is frequent and sustained throughout the day, not just during dedicated exercise sessions. Standing up every 30 minutes. Walking to the mailbox. Doing dishes by hand instead of using the dishwasher. Gardening. Dancing in the living room. All of it counts. All of it feeds your brain. All of it keeps the fog at bay. The human brain is a remarkable organ. It can rewire itself, heal itself, and grow new neurons even in old age. But only if you give it what it needs: oxygen, stimulation, and movement. Every hour you spend sitting is an hour your brain is starving. These 5 dangers: blood clots that kill without warning, heart disease that ages your arteries by decades, bones and muscles that crumble from within, diabetes that steals your sight and independence, and cognitive decline that erases who you are. They're all connected by a single thread: excessive sitting. The solution isn't complicated. Stand up every 30 minutes. Walk after meals. Move while you watch TV. Your body was designed for motion, and in old age, that motion isn't optional, it's survival. If this documentary opened your eyes to the dangers of sitting, please subscribe and share it with someone you care about. It might just save their life.